Hi everybody and welcome to Rochester. We're here today to meet with Caroline Bird to chat about her most recent poetry collection, The Air Year. I've got loads of questions to ask her, so I'm hoping she'll be able to answer some of them. And I'm excited to be able to hear some of her poems in person in her home, which is such a treat. So let's get going. Hi Caroline, thank you so much for letting us come into your home and do this.
Nice to have visitors.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not quite such normality anymore, but yeah, it's nice to be here. So we're hearing from your collection, The Air Year, today. And I want to just begin with a few questions in general about your journey into poetry as such. And you had your first collection released when you were 15 years old, which is incredibly young.
Yeah.
And I just sort of wondered how that happened. You know, what was that experience like?
How it happened, when I was 13, I won a competition called the Foyles Young Poet of the Year Awards, and the prize was to go and spend a week at an Arvin Centre and have a residential poetry course in this amazing house in Hebden Bridge called Lumbank. And it was me and all of these other teenagers who were really into poetry, which is like this amazing parallel universe where if you wrote poetry you were cool. And I'd always written poetry before then, but suddenly I was surrounded by people who were going, no, this is real. Like, this is a real thing that you can do with your life. And I was just so happy that whole week. I came home and cried for like 2 weeks straight because I felt like I'd been plucked out of my own heaven. Right? And then I won it again the next year and had another course, which was amazing. And one of the tutors said to me, "Oh, you should send some poems off to some magazines, right?" And so I bought this thing called the Writer's Handbook. They told me to buy, and I just started circling magazines, and I didn't know what any of them were, so I didn't know that I was kind of punching above my weight. So I sent 6 poems off to a magazine called PN Review. I didn't know they were connected to what's now my publisher, Carcanet. And I got a letter back from Michael Smith, and he said, you know, can you send us all the poems you've ever written? This is how I remember it anyway. It probably didn't quite happen like this, but I was like, oh, that's a very big magazine. And then it happened really quickly. What's so weird is, like, now I would go, wow, that's amazing, and I thought it was amazing at the time, but I didn't have any. I'd never sent anything off before, and I didn't have any like frame of reference, you know. But I did have 100 poems, and then I did have enough for a collection, and it all happened really quickly. And my first book was called Looking Through Letterboxes, and yeah, it came out when I was 15, which is mad.
I mean, 100 poems by that point as well. Like, that is a lot. Do you even remember a time when you weren't writing?
I started writing poems when I was about 8, but I remember like I had this kind of nook behind my bed, and I'd squeezed a beanbag into it. You know how you want to have a den,
yeah.
Like, and I would try and write a diary, but I'd write stuff down and it just wouldn't feel true. Like, I'd think, oh, I've written everything that's happened and how I feel, but somehow these words feel quite dead on the page. And so then I started turning them into what I thought were kind of little stories, but I'd write them in these long columns. Like, I remember I used to write about such worthy things. I remember when I was about 10 writing a poem about a woman who could only exist in the winter and a man who could only exist in the summer, and they fell in love, but it was doomed. you know what I mean? And then I'd come downstairs being like, to my parents going, you listen to my poem, sit down. But it was also like, I just loved it so much, but I did it in secret. Apart from, you know, when I'd like shove it in my parents' face, and they were very patient with me. But it wasn't. I was so lucky to have this editor, Michael Smith, to kind of say, you know, keep on writing the way you are. Like, obviously get better, but keep on, because at that age everything is instinctive. You're not really thinking, oh, this is my style, this is my voice. You know, I was just improvising, and and then it was obviously the like biggest boost of confidence you could get. A bit daunting as well. I remember getting a review saying that saying that they thought my book was a hoax. And they said it had, and I'm quite proud of this, the worst sestina in it ever written.
What an accomplishment!
Yes. But and the fact that I just feel very lucky. I've got my like selected poems coming out next year, I've done everything very quickly. I hope I don't have to retire and live in a cave by the time I'm 36, just to even it out. But yeah.
Well, I guess in the same vein, have you preferred being in the poetry world as an adult or as a child? It must have been really different experiences, and now you have the perspective of knowing the places that you're applying, sending your poems off to, and knowing what it all means. Was it better back then? Are you happy with how it's going now?
Okay, that's a really interesting question, because obviously poetry is this weird art form where the second you feel like you know what you're doing, you're screwed. Like, you've got to keep on unlearning it and then learning it afresh. Like, every time I write a book, I generally go through a period of not writing anything before, thinking, right, it's gone, I've lost it, it's over, and then I'll go into a different season. And one of my favourite poets, James Tate, said that I'm gonna get around to your question, I promise. It said that a poet becomes a new person every 4 years, and sometimes it feels like that. But what I'm trying to get back to is that feeling I had when I was 13 of when I wasn't worried about getting published. I just wanted to be inside the page, and the best bit was writing the poem, and that feeling of this makes sense to me because it doesn't have to make sense, and I can be safely brave on inside this. And if I forget that feeling that I felt when I was a teenager, the poetry suffers. If I have to kind of. Obviously, what I love about being a poet now is I love being part of the poetry community. It's so nice to have done enough that you don't feel riddled with. Well, I say don't feel riddled with self-doubt, but you do anyway. But it's obviously nice. It's nice to feel like the ground is a bit more solid in terms of whatever. But I constantly have to try and reignite that fire in me that I had as a teenager. Yeah. And it does get harder as you get older. You know that Bob Dylan lyric about I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like that, and sometimes I look at poems I wrote when I was younger and I'm like, oh, you little bastard. Because what it is you can't experience something for the first time twice, right? And so something that I had when I was a teenager, even though a lot of the poems are very scrappy, or there's some that I'm like horrible, but they're all kind of going, oh my god, the world, oh wow,
that first impression,
and you've got it's or like my 2-year-old son, when he looks at a snail, he's like, snail, whoa. And you have to try and get that in yourself, that feeling of, oh my god, I'm me looking out my own eyes, this is so weird, and it gets harder as you get older because it gets closer to insanity and further away from childlike wonder, and it's so that's a very long answer to your question, but it's kind of, I want to borrow from being a teenager and bring it to now, to with kind of the experience that I've got now. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Really, yeah, it definitely does. We got there.
We got there.
No, very interesting. And also, considering, as we said, considering your very early experiences, do you think that the poetry world is very accessible for young people now, more so than it used to be?
I definitely think it's more so than it used to be, for sure. When I was. When I was a teenager, sometimes for example, when I go into schools, I can really tell that when I first started going to schools, kids felt like poetry was something for dusty scholars on dusty shelves. They thought it was something, and you had to actively kind of actively show them that poetry is something else and that it could be about their lives. Whereas I feel like kids know that more now, you know, and some of those like those veils have been lifted from it, and like, but you know, we've only just started. You know, and poetry, it doesn't help. It doesn't help to see it as this kind of art form that is apart from human experience. When actually, I think poetry is one of the most human art forms, because it doesn't pretend to know anything. Poetry is all about not knowing, and all about that space in between. Well, like a moment here where I can't think of what to say next. You know, the word is about the wordlessness, and you're trying to find words for the wordlessness. You know, when you're a kid and you think, I feel a bit funny, but you don't know why. Like, so many poems are just, they're kind of from that feeling. And one thing that I think that kind of needs to be promoted, or not promoted, talked about more, is that you don't have to have something to say. Right, actually, the writing is about discovering what you mean in the process of writing. It's not that you have to sit down and go, right, I am going to say this. If you do that, then you can't. The poem can't kind of come to life. Yeah, you know, because I think sometimes people get intimidated by poetry because they think they've got to sit down and they've got to write this pearl of wisdom immediately, rather than that you can start with total bafflement and increase that bafflement as you go along, and just kind of, and also that you can have a big chunk of formless text to begin with in a first draft that isn't, you can have like a pre-first draft that looks nothing like a poem, and then chisel away at it till it starts to look like itself. You know. Yeah. So yeah.
Something else that I wanted to ask you about is, you're also a very accomplished playwright. I mean, you were shortlisted for Most Promising New Playwright at the Off West End Awards. I know you've done a lot of things like that, but I wondered if you find there's a parallel between poetry and plays, or at least in writing them.
So, yes, but there is, in the way, not in terms of style. Like, I don't write like poem plays or anything, but it's something to do with the unspoken. So, like, if you have 3 characters in a scene, for example, and they're all wrong, but the truth is somewhere in the middle, and you kind of dancing around that thing. But if you try and clasp it, then it kind of ruins the scene. So there's a similar, there's something about trusting what's not said, and the dialogue, but yeah.
Do you think that, I mean, because obviously poetry, there's like it's not a discord, but there's the written poetry on the page, and then there's poetry that you perform. And do you find that you are a natural performer?
So I think a poem has 2 stages. Like, I mean, stage as in, not stage as in section, I mean stage as in stage. So the page is a kind of stage, right? You're thinking of the way it falls down the page, you're thinking of the theatre of the page, of where you break the line, right? And there's so many decisions you make in terms of the reading experience on the page, and I do think there is a like theatricality to that. And then you take that same poem and you put it in the air, and it does change. It is different. Like, I don't generally perform my own line breaks, though they're the right line breaks for the page, for example. When I'm performing it, I want it to feel as if, and I want to feel myself as if I am just knitting it from the air, as if even though this poem I've spent like weeks or months or whatever fine-tuning, when I say it out loud, I want it to feel like it's just coming into existence. You know, I like performing. I like the kind of uncertainty feeling of it. I like the feeling that the poems are suddenly kind of released from the page, and they're alive. And also, writing is such a a lonely experience. You are leaning, when you're writing it, you are leaning out of the window of the blank page, and you do feel like you're communicating to something, but it's not an audience. When I'm writing, I'm not ever thinking about an audience when I'm writing. I'm thinking more like, it's like some peopled loneliness on the horizon that I'm writing towards that just kind of gets me. You know, I mean, or maybe doesn't, and I have to convince them. And then the performing of it, there's a kind of not catharsis exactly, because it does feel a bit more perilous than that, but like, oh, finally this poem has actually broken out of itself and reached some people. And like what I've noticed is, because obviously the book came out during the pandemic and I have not done that many in-person readings, and so I do feel like the poems are still kind of lodged in me, like I haven't properly, expunged the right word? Like I haven't kind of exorcised them from me entirely, because I've not read them out loud enough. So I do think reading them out loud is a really important part of the process, but you can't be thinking about that when you're writing. If you're thinking about an audience when you're writing, oh no, you just it's the worst type of self-censorship, because then you just start writing what you think people want to hear, which is never what they want to hear.
Definitely. Well, it's probably a good point to hear your first reading.
Okay, I'm going to read some love poems, some poems about certain love, some poems about very uncertain love. I'm going to begin with a potted history of my entire love life in one poem, so buckle up. It's called The Ground. You land on a ridge, 6 feet down the cliff, and believe you have fallen from the dread summit and survived. You think, this is the ground. Till you notice the larks passing at eye level, drop a cufflink and fall 50 feet into the open palm of another ridge, deeper in, scratched, clothes torn, you've lost a shoe, but you think, this is the ground. I can bake that lasagna now. Till a kite gets snagged in your hair. Your feet meet a plunging carpet, now you're hanging by your necklace from a branch, thinking, this is the ground, let's buy a puppy. As you sit in your bracken chair, as you fall in your chair like a lopped flower head, face planting, yes, ground in a tree, wind burnt for momentum, whiplash by your own screams, ups, then ups, straddling a lamppost, a pillar, a shed, each time believing this is the ground, believing you've survived, falling, landing, falling out, who knows how long you've been travelling down this thing, incrementally, held in the loosening, tightening fist of a giant with a featureless face. Thud. At last, I can put up that shelf. Make that baby. You lie and let your bones heal, looking up at the distance, experiencing plateau for the first time. Cold, hard, real, the opposite of air. You shake like a prodigal astronaut. I could build a house on this, you think, staggering off. There's lots of staggering in my poems. From the air year, there's lots of falling through the air. There's lots of people suspended in midair. A lot of confusion. This next poem came from an exercise or a game I gave myself, where I thought, what if my entire love life was a town? And as a result, I came up with actually an unforgivable pun. So this is called Loveborough. You're allowed one terrible pun per book, and then you can't do it again. So it's called Loveborough. No one dies here or chews their food properly. We break bread rolls in half and choke until we gulp. We hit small children whenever we gesticulate. We stay up all night, talking animatedly to dial tones. Occasionally someone faints and we hold a funeral, then shout, "It's a miracle," when they inevitably revive. We shout miracle a lot. When the coffee is drinkable. When the drizzle stops. No one keeps receipts. Our tenement buildings are modelled after comfortable Scandinavian prisons. So we get our groceries home delivered, chill out most of the year, lightly repent. The most beautiful woman in the world around here is called Samantha, and she loves me She sent a letter telling me so. I read it to my cactus and it flowered. My yearning often paralyses me in my armchair for entire days. The phone just rings and rings. Samantha leaves long voicemails screaming, "Wake up," petrified I'm dead. She's adorable like that. I'm an addict. I keep a pill on the roof of my mouth, but never swallow it. I will never swallow it. No one dies here or grinds their pepper. We pour peppercorns onto our pasta. In our crumbling music halls, we sing about finality, then trail off before the last verse, laugh, pour a big wine. We don't end romances. We let them overlap indefinitely until we forget their names. Christmas is a shit show. We spend ages stuffing all the lies back into ourselves. Samantha says she wants to move to a different town. She says our local traditions are enfeebling. Our quicksand foot spas, our seated silent discos, our in-house pub crawls, just crawling around one pub, our shame bracelets. She says she could love me forever if I ran away with her to somewhere bright, with breathable fabrics, without the faces of ex-lovers plastered on all the billboards, plus their phone numbers, a place where people are allowed to move on, get well, find a different answer to their lives. But I'm your answer, I say, and you're mine. Why would you want to find an answer that isn't me? She sighs and says, "Oh, Caroline," in that hurt twang, like I'm missing the point. I put on Suzanne by Leonard Cohen, but she kicks the record player, shouting, "No, I will not touch your perfect body with my mind. I want a nourishing relationship," then storms off before I can feed her an orange. I lie beneath the bubbles of my bath all day, breathing through a curly straw. Samantha's not like the others. She expects something from me. I wish I knew what. So carrying on the theme of confusion and not knowing how to be a human being. Basically the structure of these two sets is things are going to get more and more confused, and then there'll be a glimmer of light at the end, then it'll be over. That's the structure. Okay, so this is a poem called Rookie, about having no idea about anything. You thought you could ride a bicycle, but turns out those weren't bikes, they were extremely bony horses. And that wasn't a meal you cooked, that was a microwaved hockey puck. And that wasn't a book, that was a taco stuffed with daisies. What if you thought you could tie your laces, but all this time you were just wrapping a whole roll of sellotape around your shoe and hoping for the best? And that piece of paper you thought was your tax return? A crayon drawing of a cat. And your best friend is actually a scarecrow you stole from a field and carted away in a wheelbarrow. Your mobile phone is a strip of bark with numbers scratched into it. Thousands of people have had to replace their doors at much expense after you battered theirs to bits with a hammer, believing that was the correct way to enter a room. Everyone's been so confused by you, pouring pints over your head, talking to babies in a terrifyingly loud voice, lying on the floor of buses, opening a bottle of wine with a cutlass, all the while nodding to yourself like, yeah, this is how it's done. Planting daffodils in a bucket of milk. Okay. So you know that feeling when you text someone and then they start replying and you see the little dots come on the phone, you're like, oh, and then the dots disappear and you think, well, they better have been hit by a bus. What the hell? This is, if that feeling was a whole state of mind that you were perpetually in, it would be this poem. It's called Anesthetic. Just one word, send me one word, any word. Lysol, shellac, ditto, and I'll feel better for an hour. until the pain comes back. And then I'll need 2 words. Any 2 words. Dessert fork, shipping agency, frosty fields, and I'll feel better for 45 minutes, and then I'll need 3 words. I love you. Boom. I'll feel better for a whole entire day. Just smacked off my face on reciprocation. Say it again. Say it twice. I love you is 6 words. Now pimp it up. Add so much with all my heart until I die. And I'll feel better for a minute. And then I'll get sick. Itchy. Fist banging on your door at night, demanding words. You owe me 10 words. I can't bear this anymore. I'm going crazy without you. Say that. I'll scrape up the butts of old words from past messages and suck on them till my lips burn. I'll start asking for things that don't make sense. Carve love into my leg. Spray paint the walls of my womb. Inject me with kisses. Make my blood read it. I'll get the twitches, the shakes, the cold sweats, the dream where I'm 3 foot tall, whispering, talk to me. To a shock of golden curls that slowly turns to reveal its face, looks just like the back of its head. But for now, I only need 1 word. Rowanbury, filament, plank. I'm going to read a slightly longer one now. I set myself a kind of writing instruction, if you like, which is the epigraph to the book, which is from Thomas Tranströmer, and it says, in the middle of the forest there's an unexpected clearing that can only be found by those who have gotten lost. Basically, I would give myself a first line that meant I could have no idea where I was going, and then I'd just keep striding out into the nothingness and get lost until I stumbled upon an unexpected clearing. And then obviously your subconscious has to take over. So this poem ended up being about all my deepest sexual insecurities. But, you know, it wouldn't have happened if I'd intended that to be the case. This is called Nancy and the Torpedo. Nancy found an entire torpedo in the forest, just lying there like a beached whale, coated in wet leaves and decorated with glittering snail trails. It's a fucking torpedo, she said. Is it live? I said. I didn't know how torpedoes worked. Were they like mines? It's inert, she said, suddenly an expert. Torpedoes don't explode on land, everyone knows that. She whistled like a plumber surveying a damp patch. He's a beauty, all right. I reckon he weighs at least 600 pounds. 640, I'd say. He, I said. But Nancy was already straddling it, spanking its rudder like the rump of a prize horse. What's a torpedo doing in a forest? Nancy rolled her eyes. You always ask the most obvious questions, don't you? Can't you just enjoy the moment? She'd already unzipped her trousers and was touching herself, grinding up against the girth of the weapon and groaning gently. Careful, I said. Her orgasm gathered to a scream. She pressed her sweating face on the warhead and fell asleep on top of it. The torpedo precisely matched the length of her body. To my tired gaze, it seemed as though they were both breathing, Nancy and the torpedo, their chests rising and falling together like unsuspecting ocean waves. I pictured them both in action, underwater, Nancy's legs wrapped around its speeding shaft, her red eyes fixed like sniper dots on the target ahead, a string of bubbles flying out behind her like a chiffon scarf. Eventually she woke, refreshed and cheerful, patted the torpedo goodbye, hoisted on her backpack, and we continued our journey as if nothing had happened. Where are we going? She'd ask, every 10 minutes or so. We've just got to keep moving, I'd reply, pointing in some arbitrary direction and striding with purpose, trying to channel the sexual energy of a self-propelled missile. Keep on moving. The dread swished around my gums like someone else's tongue. If I had owned a penis, it would have secretly shriveled in my pants. We've passed this clearing before, Nancy said. Different clearing, I said. Those are our footprints from 4 days ago, she said. Different footprints, I said. Then we saw the torpedo. Nancy laughed. I suppose you're going to tell me that's a different torpedo. It was getting dark and cold. I love you. I just love you so much, I said, as Nancy remounted, hugging it and whispering into its back, her mouth almost kissing the metal. That's when I lost it. I'm sorry I'm not a fucking torpedo. I can't blast through shit. I'm lost and I'm useless and I've got no fucking idea where I am or what I'm doing. There, I said it, so go ahead and dump me because I'm a piece of shit. There was a long silence. Nancy straightened her spine like a dressage rider, looked at me for an age, then said, how many times do I have to prove it to you? Prove what? I said. She sighed. What could be more useless and impotent than a dud torpedo in a forest? I don't understand, I said. She peeled a snail from its propeller and threw it at me. I know exactly who you are, she said, slapping the steel. You and him are headed in the same direction. You mean nowhere? She unzipped her trousers and reached down. Fat tears appeared on her cheeks like rain. I didn't understand why she was crying. You stupid idiot, she said, her breath quickening as she rubbed and grinded. Can't you see I'm doing this for you? Can't you see I'm exploding for the both of us?
Thank you for your first reading. So, within that first reading and the collection as a whole, you talk quite openly about love and sex and relationships and marriage, all these different concepts. And I wondered if you find that vulnerability, if it's like scary, or if there's almost, because the way that you talk about them isn't always all happy and lovely. There's a lot of like grittiness and it can be quite dark. And I wondered if there's like a freedom in divulging that, especially with like whoever's reading it. But yeah, is it a scary thing for you, or is it just sort of liberating?
It's scarier to read them out loud than it is to... no, that's not quite true. Like, when I'm writing, it's about tricking myself into feeling like nobody's ever going to read it, right? And also completely surrendering to the game of the poem. So what I mean by that is, for example, in this book, I set myself this game of giving myself often first lines, like Nancy found a whole torpedo in the forest, found an entire torpedo in the forest, that I couldn't know where that was going to go. And then I just had to write to find out who Nancy was, to find out why a torpedo was in the forest, you know, and just keep writing. And so I wasn't intending to write about... I wasn't intending to write about anything. Yeah. I was just intending to keep on committing to the images and exploring the world. And then when you do that, it's like a dream, in the way that you know your anxieties and your hopes and your feelings and everything, they just bubble up through the images, and you can't not write about yourself, I found, if I'm just surrendering to this world that it's like trying to build the road that you're walking down, you know, in a first draft. And that gives me a kind of courage, but it's like so there's a poem by James Tate called I Take Back All My Kisses, which starts with, they got me because if the forest has no end, I'll go naked, right? And like this idea, you kind of convince yourself that the forest has no end. No, you're never gonna be at the end of the forest like blinking, surrounded by cameras, and then the forest is no end, so you can be completely naked, and it's never going to come to light. And then afterwards, I'll have written the poem and I'll go, oh God, that's really personal, or oh God, what's my partner going to think of that, or whatever. Yeah. But then that's the only way to get to the truth of the matter, is you've got to go. I often say this thing about trying to get disqualified from the poem. So if I reach what it feels like the ending of a poem, where like the image has kind of neatly resolved itself or whatever, I'll go, no, carry on. I've got to carry on until the poem starts to either hurt, or it tells me something I didn't know I knew, or, you know, there's some kind of realization of some kind, and then that's what makes the poems go to a really personal place generally, because even the sonnets in this book were all from the end of a long poem, so I kept on writing till it started to hurt, you know, and so then emotional risk, if you like, becomes a bit of a game. You're like, I've got to carry on until something happens, you know. But then once you've written the poems, you do think, oh wow, this is a bit exposing. But the irony then becomes like people listen to the poems and they just think about themselves, which is kind of what you want, because the secret that no one tells us is that we all have just the different variations of the same secrets, but we're just going around going, no one must see my soul is so unique, like my pain, no one understands my pain, and then you write about your pain and everyone's like, oh yeah, I felt that.
Yeah. Do you think that do you think you've become braver over time in sharing those? Has that always been the case with your poetry? You've been very sort of open.
Oh yeah, I've definitely become braver in the way that I think become less well, for example, when I was younger, I used to always say you instead of her. And that was because my dad made a well-meaning comment when I was having my first book out, where he was like, you know, if the poems are like overtly gay, people might think stuff, you know, and maybe he was right at that time, like, but probably not, but it wedged itself into my heart, that doubt, you know, for quite a long time actually. And it wasn't until my fifth book that I started writing. I managed to shatter that myth in me that writing a gay poem wasn't the same as writing a universal poem, you know, because you carry around so much of this like internalized homophobia, and I used to also censor myself with surrealism, right? Because that's a funny thing. Like, writing is this weird tension between the desire to hide and the desire to reveal. You're like, I want to confess everything, but I also am going to wrap it up in an image, and I'm going to disguise it in the language of dreams. And that is how you make a poem. But if you are hiding too much, you can kind of, you know, if you're putting a disguise on a disguise on a disguise, like, then people can't access it. They can't feel what's inside. And I think there's some poems, especially in my early 20s, where I was so full of shame about so many things that the poems don't quite connect, because I'm not naked in the forest, you know. Like, and it's interesting to kind of tell that, but bravery is not it's not a linear thing. Like, you go through a stage of feeling like, oh, you know, and then it kind of shuts up again, and there's so many things in my life that I have not written about, you know, that I'm like, no, I'm not going there, going there. But that's part of the whole journey as I've been a writer, to know that there's still so many unopened boxes, and that the forest has no end.
Before we move on to your second reading, I had one last question, which was, in general, I mean, this collection came out, as you said, it came out before the pandemic. It was February 2020, but it's almost accidentally, it's become even more applicable now after the past year and a half that we've all experienced, you know, this idea of instability and unsteady footing, you know, that sort of goes throughout the collection as a whole. I don't know how you'll feel about applying it to your own work, but do you think that, like, the sign of a good poem would be one that can last in that way, that can sort of ebb and flow and be, you know, it can be applicable to different stages of life?
I definitely, like, I mean, my favourite poems, I've read them over and over throughout my whole life, and they're like they're like prisms, you hold them at a slightly different angle to yourself, and they refract different light, and that's what means that they never properly die, because they're never done, and the great thing about a poem is that you can't paraphrase it. Just like a person, you can't say, "Oh, this person means this," or you don't stand in front of the ocean and go, "But what does this mean?" And that's what kind of keeps it alive. So, I hope, and I'm very encouraged by the thought that the poems can be held at different angles and by different hands and mean different things, and that's part of them being alive, and they can trot off into the world and do their own thing and leave me alone.
Well, we'll see more of that in your second reading now.
So the book is called The Air Year, which is quite difficult to say. My 2-year-old son sometimes sounds like he's saying it by accident, just when he goes, yeah, like that. And it's partly based on that first year of a relationship where everything is, well, up in the air, but you feel kind of like there's no ground underneath you, and you feel excited, but also like there is extreme peril. And the first poem in the book is called Midair. It's about, that moment just before a first kiss. What if you were locked in that moment forever and it never actually happened? Midair. There is a corner of the city where the air is soft resin. Step in and it hardens around you, suspended in amber. We made the mistake of kissing there. Here. Our mouths midway across the same inhalation, like robbers mid-leap between rooftops. If kisses were scored by composers, they'd place the breath on the upbeat. Oh, God. Music preceded by mid-air, when the baton lifts, the orchestra tightens, and before the 1, 2, 3, and the sunlight is meticulous, and the river holds its tongue, and your silver earring steals like an aerialist's hoop, caught mid-spin, a note almost sung, locked in the amber of the and. We just want to land, or be landed on. So there's lots of falling in the book, so there's lots of exploding, there's lots of disappearing and dissolving. This next poem, it was inspired by, I hate that, inspired by, it's implying that it was inspired. This poem came from a commission about gay pride, which I thought I didn't think I'd find it easy, but I thought I'd find it I thought I'd know where I was coming from, because I've known I was gay since I was 13. But actually, gay pride is quite a complicated feeling, because it's a antidote to feeling ashamed, or to being told to feel ashamed. And so it's not like a just, an everyday kind of pride. There's like a sadness in it as well, and there's hurt. It's as if like every sequin they have on every march is used to overcome a tiny bit of darkness, and we're going to need millions of sequins forever, And I was researching a bar called the Gateways, which is one of the few places that lesbians could meet safely in London in the 1930s and 40s. And the description of it on Wikipedia starts with, through a green door, down a steep flight of stairs, into a windowless cellar. And I thought it's quite rare that the literal description of a place is also a metaphor. So this is a poem called Dive Bar. Through a red door, down a steep flight of stairs, into a windowless cellar with sweating walls. An ingenue in a smoking jacket sits astride a piano. as a host of swaying women sing your secret safe with me, and one invites you into the privacy of a kiss, all these dark clandestine places. And you find yourself imagining a very tiny woman walking straight into her mouth, through a red door, down a steep flight of stairs, into a windowless cell with breathing walls. An ingenue in a smoke jacket sits astride a piano, as a host of swallowed women sing your secrets in a safe. The barmaid shakes a custom cocktail she calls a private kiss, all these dark, half-eaten faces, and you find yourself imagining a tiny, tiny woman walking straight into her mouth, through a red breath, down a dark thought, into a swallowed sense with shrinking walls. An innuendo in stomach acid slops astride a piano, as a host of silent passions mouth your secret is yourself, inside the belly of the world. All these dark, dissolving spaces, and you find yourself imagining a windowless woman, breaking walls down in herself, sprinting up the shrinking halls, and up contracting corridors, and up the choking fits of dark thoughts, through hard stairs and dead laws, through the red door, as it swallows shut behind you. Now you're spat out on the pavement, with the sun just coming out. Okay. Whew. Right. So, continuing on with this theme of not having any idea what I was doing, and that being kind of writing practice of deliberately getting lost so I could find an unexpected clearing, I thought, what if I write a poem from the point of view... what if I write a poem about a profession I have absolutely no idea about? So this poem is called I Am Not a Falconer. I am standing in this field, holding my glove in the air. Should I whistle? I can't whistle. Will she get lost? Take shelter in a charming tree. It's starting to rain. Is that bad? This is a woolly glove. Calm down. Falconers are patient. It's very windy. The sky is so big, she could be literally anywhere. Penzance, India. Why did I let her go? I'm not a falconer. Do I just keep standing here? I'd go home and change into appropriate footwear. But what if I missed her? I bet falcons are like FedEx. The second you nip to the loo. What am I talking about? Falconers don't get antsy. A falconer just knows. I lift my fist higher. If my arm gets tired, I'll switch arms. Miss, like I'm asking God a question. Please come back to me. Through the wind and the rain. Come back, even though you're free. I'm drenched. My glove is wrong. And you are not a falcon. It's my version of a love poem. Sometimes I'll write poems and my partner will be like, thank God I actually like poems, otherwise I'd probably think this was some kind of insult. This poem, so there's quite a few sonnets in the book, and they were all accidents. They all happened after the end of a long, boring poem that I couldn't stand. And this poem I was writing about a panic attack, and it was so awful, and I hated it so much. I hated the poem so much that I decided to die in the poem because I thought, well, there's nothing else for it. I'm just going to have to die. And then suddenly, the unexpected clearing. This little sonnet appeared, and it was a love poem. But I could never have got there if I'd tried to do it on purpose. It's called Checkout. I think, so this is death, and wonder why I can still see through my eyes. An angel approaches with a feedback form, asking how I'd rate my life. Very good, good, average, bad, very bad. And I intend to tick average, followed by a rant. Then I recall your face, like a cartoon treasure chest, glowing with gold light. Tick very good. And in the comment box below I write, nice job. The angel asks if I enjoyed my stay, and I say, oh yes, I'd definitely come again. And he gives me a soft look, meaning that won't be possible, but thanks all the same. Clicks his pen and vanishes. So there's quite a few prose poems in the book. Prose poems sounds like a kind of intimidatingly heavy thing. But what I love about prose poems, right, is they are disguised as paragraphs, right? See? Yes. You think nothing weird can happen in a paragraph. It's not even a poem. Hasn't even got any line breaks. Must be pretty normal. And then you can get really mad really quickly. This is called Urban Myth. Do you remember the one about the bomber plane during World War II? Riddled with bullets from enemy fire, and the plucky pilot who took 5 packs of Wrigley's chewing gum from his pocket and told his crew to chew. Chew, crew! So they chewed, ripping strip after strip from their foil sleeves to bung the bullet holes, plugging each perforation with a tooth-marked blob like a wax seal, wet and glistening, stamped with their personal crest. 6 lads on the plane, or 4 or 5, 7 strips per pack, so that's 35 pieces of gum. It'd take at least 3 minutes, or maybe it'd just take a minute. Their jaws would ache and they'd be ridiculously minty. Smoke and fire out the window, planes spiralling down out of the sky towards the ocean. I don't even know if that's how planes work, or if gumming punctures keeps you airborne. I guess you can't have all that wind shrieking through it. Well, anyway, it's not a true story. If it were true, you'd have heard of it. Maybe I saw it in a cartoon. I like it because it's literally the only idea I'd have if I was asked to bung a bullet hole. We played our love like that for a while. Chewing, then stoppering. A patch-up job, cobbled in midair from whatever we had in our pockets at the time. Fighting fire with blobs of miscellaneous optimism. Aiming only for temporary insulation, to stopper the sky, whistling through us, stay airborne, unofficial and miraculous, cork each new wound with a wad of sweetness, freshly printed from the panic of our mouths. I'm going to end with one more, a little one. It's based on a true story, but I won't tell you what the story was. It's called The Insurmountables. Let's say a married man with tears for eyes made a talisman from a feather and a dead butterfly and burnt it in the corner of the garden. And far away, a woman felt a burning, felt a cloud pop in her ribs, a sudden terrifying lightness in her hand, jolted in her chair like someone falling in a dream. And her husband said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Nothing." As the wings caught fire, and fire became flight, and the dead butterfly translated into smoke, and something was released back into the wild and untrained air, where love is born before we take it home. Thank you.
Thank you for a brilliant second reading. So something that I picked up on with your poems is that they, you start the poem and you're sort of like, and you get to the end and you're like, you didn't expect to arrive where you did, where you started. It's sort of all the way through. You're like, where will it take you? Almost very sort of not linear is how they feel, and because they're these really sort of busy, compact poems, and I find it interesting because it gives an insight into the way that you're thinking and the way that you're exploring it. But how do you even go about taming your thoughts in that way when the poems are so compact and there's so much going on in them?
Well, it's different for each poem. Taming my thoughts. Okay. well, for example, with Dive Bar, like sometimes it's helpful if I just talk through the drafting process. So with Dive Bar, like all I had was the beginning, which was through a red door down a steep flight of stairs into a windowless cellar, right? So I wrote that down, and then I was writing about a bar, and it was just this big chunk of text like this, and it was getting very boring because I was just kind of writing stuff about an imagined bar, and so I got bored, and then I thought, well, what if I just walk into this woman's mouth, right? And then suddenly I had a kind of not a structure, but I had a kind of game. It was like, okay, so now I've walked into this woman's mouth. Oh, and now I'm in another bar. Okay, well that's interesting. Well, I should do it again. And then so I go back to that first draft, which is all formless, and I go, okay, so what's the game of this poem? The game is that I go into a bar, and then I'm in another one's, and then I keep on going, right? So then that makes sense that I should change the word slightly every time, because it's like the word is... So I start then slowly to marry the form with the content, you know? And you're just kind of keeping your ear to the almost like keeping your ear to the ground of the poem, going, okay, what do you need? Tell me, right? But always referring back to that first draft, which is always full of clues about how the poem wants to be written. And it's not always about making it neater either. There are some. It's like if you'd written a poem, it's always about listening to that specific poem and what it needs. So, say you'd written a poem about, I don't know, a woman turning into a bird, and it was all full of airy, right? You might go, okay, well, I'm gonna... Actually, there's a brilliant poem by Liz Berry like this, and she, you know, it's all laid out on the page, kind of, in these, like, feathers almost, falling down the page, and that makes sense, because it fits with the... But say you'd written a poem about a tumultuous love affair, you might go, okay, I think this needs to be set out like a fevered column, and I'm gonna have no stanza breaks, and no full stops, and break the line in a really breathless place, because that fits with the poem, you know. So you're making all of these choices as it goes along to make the poem, the spirit of the poem, fit the form of the poem. But I always think of form in this really like animal way. Like, it's not about trying to make it look like a neat poem. It's about listening, going, what is the spirit of this thing? And what body should it be in? So, you know, there's a poem in there called Fancy Dress, which is like, ah! You know, it's a poem that just doesn't stop. And it wouldn't make sense if I made it all neat on the page like that. That just wouldn't allow it to be itself, you know. So sometimes, if a poem can look really messy on the page, but I've done that on purpose. I've done that on purpose. But I don't know if that answers your question, but it's about listening. What is the game of the poem? Yeah. What are the images? How do I serve it on every stage, and not try and make it more like itself, rather than trying to turn it into something else. And I always keep all the drafts, because often I'll get insecure towards the end, and I'll start scalpeling, thinking this has got to be much neater, and then I'll realise I've like cut a major artery, and then I'm going, okay, why is the poem dead? Speak to me, poem. And I have to go back to a slightly earlier draft, you know, and realise, oh, that line I thought was just a throwaway line was actually vital to the whole, you know, heart of it, whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just as you sort of said earlier, overcoming that idea of poetry being like this old, kind of stuffy thing. Your poetry really combats that. It's never boring in any way, shape or form. And I think there's also something about I don't know how you feel about like comedy in like humour in poems, because, you know, like Loughborough, even just like the title is like a nice little fun thing that you commented on, and then you have like these sort of like cartoonish characters that pop up every now and again. Is that like intentional, that side that can sort of be seen as kind of funny?
Oh, I mean, it's intentional in the way that if I can generally tell if I'm like if I was in quite a lot of emotional turmoil or pain, if the poems get really funny. It's a bit like standing on hot sand, and you can't stand still, you know. You got to, it's like jaunty trauma.
Okay.
Like, you know when something is a bit too hard to talk about, so you avert your eyes a lot and you meander around it or whatever. Like, I'm never laughing when I'm writing. I'm generally, the funniest poems that I write are when I'm very upset. And then I look at it afterwards. I go, oh yeah, I suppose that's quite funny. Or sometimes I have no idea it's funny, and I'll read it out loud, and that people will laugh, and my first reaction will be, well, to hell with it. This is what are you laughing at, you bastards? You know, but occasionally it's intentional. Occasionally I like to do this kind of trick with myself when I'm writing, where you kind of almost put yourself at ease on purpose, so that you can then disarm yourself quickly. You know, so I always think, humour is kind of should make things worse rather than easier.
Definitely. And just as we sort of come to the end, I wondered, you lead a lot of like workshops and stuff, and you are a judge this year for the T.S. Eliot Prize. So you must be filtering through quite a lot of poems at the moment, and you've advised a lot of people about their poetry in the past. And I wondered if you had just like one nugget of wisdom to give to viewers at home, poets who might be looking to, I don't know, get their work published, or just having the confidence to start writing. If there's one piece of advice that you could give to people writing poetry.
Okay. You have to trust the images, right? That your job as the poet is to dream the dream, not translate it, right? You dream it, you trust the images, and the reader can wake up from it and go, oh, what did that mean? But your job is yet to stay with it. I often say this thing about the metaphor doesn't know it's a metaphor. The metaphor thinks it's real, right? And so if you just, whatever you're writing, you just commit to, this is real. You know, this icicle doesn't represent fear. It's an actual icicle. Then the fear will take care of itself. You know, and writing will be a lot more fun and magical if you trust your images and trust yourself, the subconscious. And in that first draft is all about stepping out into the sky. It's all about not knowing. My favourite quote is by Winslow Szymborska, when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1996. And she stood up to get the prize and she said, I don't know anything about poetry. She won the Nobel Prize. She said, whatever inspiration is, it's born from a continuous I don't know. Right? Which I love. But that thing of, you find an image, you find half a thought, half a thing, and you just then step out into the blankness of the page, and then you find that the blankness is the best bit, because you can't have something without first having nothing.
That is a brilliant nugget of wisdom to end
That's
on.
not more than a nugget, would it? I'm not concise, am I? Jesus.
Well, I've had so much fun chatting to you and hearing how you approach poetry and everything behind the air year, so thank you so much for chatting to me.
Thank you.
And I'll hand over to you for one last poem.
Okay. This is a poem about that feeling when you first fall in love, when everything is so amazing, you think, this can't possibly be real. Surrealism for beginners. We're trapped inside a movie, apparently. Last month, the grand secret was disclosed to us via these giant faces in the sky, claiming to be producers, benevolently dropping by to let us know we were characters trapped inside their movie, and that every decision we made from now on would be in the script, and therefore we shouldn't blame ourselves too much or get overly self-critical. Some of us were villains, some bit parts, some heroes, but everyone was necessary for the story and important in their own way. Then the sky went blank, and everyone turned to each other and made that sound crowds make after receiving unexpected news. Hubbub, hubbub. We're in a movie! Of course! People kept shouting. It all makes sense now. So that's why my shoes don't come off. So that's why I'm always losing money on the same horse. So that's why I gel my hair like a vampire. I am a vampire. I knew I looked too young to be a grandma, said my grandma. What am I, 38? They all seemed so reassured, so validated. The next day, they resumed their roles with gusto. The greengrocer started throwing apples at children as a gesture of goodwill and then winking. My auntie began consciously bustling through doorways. Tramps cut the fingers off their gloves, practiced saying, "God bless us all," then coughing in chorus. Nothing really changed exactly. Reality just got more pronounced, like someone underlined the word normal in our stage directions, But I'm not buying it. Trapped inside a movie. What is this? Surrealism for beginners? Yes, I keep bursting into song whenever the streetlights come on. Yes, I keep chasing the girl of my dreams across New York. Yes, we walk hand in hand along the moonlit river as the disembodied voice of Ella Fitzgerald drifts through the glowing blossom trees, but these are merely facts and not the whole truth. I don't care what the producers in the sky say. They're not in my heart, they don't know the subtle earthquake of her eyes. I don't care if there's a script with these lines written in it, or some douchebags throwing popcorn at a screen. I can't see a screen. I can't see anything but her. And I need to tell her how I feel. And my boat leaves in the morning, and she is on the other side of Manhattan.
So we've just finished filming with Caroline, and I've had such a fantastic time chatting to her and listening to her read her poetry in person. It was such a treat. All poetry from the Air year, her most recent collection, which won the Forward Prize in 2020. I feel like we've learned a lot about both reading and writing poetry, and I hope everyone at home has too. So a huge thank you to Caroline for her time, and to everyone who's tuned in online to join us at home stage.
You land on a ridge, 6 feet down the cliff, and believe you have fallen from the dread summit and survived. You think, this is the ground.